All right, everyone. Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thrilled to have you join us today for Liftoff's third session, our final session of our summer learning series. It's great that you're here with us. We've had a lot of interest in this program, and 'tis the season for vacations and summer plans. So many folks have said, I can't join you, but this is such an important topic. Please send me the slides and the recording after. So please know, for those of you who are with us right now and live, we'll be sure to send the recording and the slides after today so that you'll have those. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Bonsignor. I'm the director of Liftoff of Western New York. And if you're even newer to Liftoff, we are an aligned action and learning network of funders and Western New York leaders who are really trying to coalesce around a common set of early childhood priorities, such as high quality, affordable, accessible, and available childcare, increasing developmental screening rates, and connection to timely services and supports, such as early intervention and preschool special education. And our learning series is, this summer series is part of our larger learning network, where we're really trying to, throughout the year, spotlight some really critical issues that are happening across Western New York and the state. We want to spotlight existing initiatives and early childhood coalitions and partnerships in Western New York and also the state. And of course, continue to raise awareness of some emerging challenges for young children, such as our couple last sessions ago around early childhood oral health, and today featuring early literacy. And in that spirit, I'd like to welcome and introduce our featured program and speaker today. When I first read the Education Trust of New York's report, A Call to Action, the State of Early Literacy in New York, I was incredibly motivated and incredibly outraged by the findings in the report and really the deep disparities that exist for children and families in New York State. I said to myself, this was a story that needed to be told and uplifted, and one that Liftoff needed to robustly champion and bring to the Western New York and New York State community as a partner of Ed Trust and their companion Raising New York Coalition. So with that, I'm thrilled that Jeff Smink, the Deputy Director of the Education Trust of New York, joins us today. For those of you who don't know Jeff, he is a mover and shaker for young children in New York State and a true champion and expert when it comes to cradle to career and supporting our youngest learners. Jeff brings over 20 years of experience in education policy at the national, state, and local levels, and is work. We'll just thank you. So with that, Jeff has a lot of expertise nationally, statewide, local levels. He led his own consulting practice, collaborating with a whole range of organizations and agencies. Many of you know them well: City Year of Buffalo, High Achievement New York, YMCA of the USA, and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Prior to consulting, Jeff was a co-founder and vice president of policy at the National Summer Learning Association, and he was the New York State director at the National Center on Time and Learning. And again, as I just read his esteemed bio, he's really a true mover and shaker and expert in this space. Before I turn it over to Jeff to start the presentation, I'll just reiterate that we are recording the session and we'll have the slides available and the presentation after today for your future viewing. So with that, Jeff, I will pass the mic over to you. And again, thank you everyone for being here.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel. Thanks for that nice introduction. It's great to be with you all today. Appreciate, I know it's as Rachel said, middle of the summer. So glad you all could make it. So maybe I'll just start with a little bit of background on myself and just how I got to this issue, because I think it'll sort of inform the presentation. So as Rachel mentioned, I've worked in education policy most of my career for a long time. But about maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I started working with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And at the same time, I was doing I live in Rochester, by the way. And so I was doing some volunteer work here in Rochester at one of the city schools, ostensibly to teach kids how to read. And so there were two things going on. So one, at the campaign, we were working with communities all around the country that were doing like this amazing work, particularly in that early childhood space, the 0 to 5, but their third grade, fourth grade reading outcomes were still, frankly, really, really bad, right? And so my mind kept spinning, like what's missing? And then as I was tutoring, I worked with one student who I developed a really close relationship with, and the goal of the program was to reading with a child, once a week as a way to sort of boost literacy outcomes. And I would read with him every week. And I remember one week we kept reading the same book, and the next I came to one week and I said, do you want to give it a try? And he read the book. And I was like, oh my God, I did it. I taught this kid how to read. And then we tried another book and he couldn't do it. And so I realized, oh, he just memorized the words. And so I don't know, it just got my mind thinking, like, as a policy person working on these issues, like, how do kids actually learn how to read? And I didn't know, right? And so it sort of started me on a journey for the last several years. I've done both consulting work on this issue of early literacy and how kids learn to read, which just sort of happened to coincide with, I'm sure you're familiar with the science of reading movement that we'll be talking about. And then when this role at Trust New York opened up, honestly, one of the reasons I wanted to join is because I wanted to lead some work on early literacy across the state, because as we'll see in the presentation, New York is way, way behind the rest of the country when it comes to policy around early literacy. So all that, I just wanted to share that background as kind of how I came into this work, and literacy has become kind of my passion project. We work on everything from, cradle to career, graduation rates, which is all important, but to me, literacy is foundational, and it's something we need to do a better job on. So just wanted to share that background, and then I will share my screen and just go through a few slides. And try to keep this, feel free to interrupt. We're a small group. It's middle of August, so let's keep it super informal. Feel free to jump in, challenge me, ask questions. We're still just being really open. Like we're still testing messaging and, just making sure we have the right language. And this is, as you know, a pretty contentious issue. So feel free to jump in, as needed, and then we'll have plenty of time, I think, for Q&A when we get past the slides. So I just I like to kind of level set and just kind of talk about, and this was the impetus for the report, which I'll talk about, but sort of what do we know about reading, nationally, but in New York State particularly. And this is what drives me, and I think what drives Ed Trust, and I know a lot of you. So, and I'm hopeful, like most people can agree on some of these pieces. So one, we come at this beyond the academics, right? Reading is a civil right, it's a human right, it's foundational for full participation in American society. I hope people agree with that. If not, then, then it's a different issue, but that's step one for us. The second one, right, is we know that when students can't read, particularly by the end of third grade, it can lead, doesn't necessarily always lead, but it can lead to increased dropout rates, right? The data shows, particularly in a place like Rochester or Buffalo, it's about 8 times higher dropout rate. That leads to increased arrest rates, juvenile justice challenges, incarceration rates, and obviously all those things affect things across the community, right? Poverty, unemployment, public safety, health challenges. I live in Rochester, as I said. I know a lot of people are in Buffalo. Like, it's been a challenging summer, a challenging year, I think, in our cities. If you look at the cars that are being stolen, we have like 13 and 14-year-olds driving stolen cars all over the city, among other huge challenges. And, for me, there's a line between the challenges we're seeing across our state and the fact that kids can't read. Like, I would guess that a lot of those kids are either have dropped out of school or are not able to read, right? So we see a clear line between the challenges we see, in New York and across the country, and not being able to read. So just continuing on, this is more on the academic side and the data side. So as I'm sure many of you know, there's research showing that 95% of all students can learn to read with the right support. Yet in New York State, looking at data, whether we're looking at state data, federal data, local data, we know that's not the case, right? Across the state, less than half of all third graders are reading proficiently. In Rochester, it's 9 out of 10. In Buffalo, it's almost 8 out of 10. At the state level, we're ranked 37th in fourth grade reading. I think the thing that's most concerning, if you look at NAEP, is that 42% of fourth graders are below basic, the lowest level on NAEP, right? Meaning that they lack even partial mastery of reading skills. Those numbers are much higher for Black and Hispanic students. And then when we look at teacher prep programs, there's significant challenges there as well. So, and I see I think someone raised their hand, so I'll finish this slide and then happy to answer anything. So we know all that, yet we haven't provided educators and students with the support and instruction that they deserve. And then maybe just do one more slide and then I'm happy to stop. And then just the last thing. So there was just a study that came out from the Shanker Institute showing 46 states have passed legislation aligned with the science of reading. New York State is one of the 4 that has not done really anything and really have been largely silent on this issue, even though it's a national movement that is happening all over the country. And so I we'll stop here and pose this question to all of you and this is something that frankly angers me a lot, is given all those things I just shared, and I'm sure most of you already knew this information, why are we okay with this situation where in our cities 9 out of 10 kids are not reading proficiently? Like, what is that? I don't know. I'm always blown away that each year the data comes out and there's really silence. It's been normalized, right? We've come to almost expect some of these data points, even though we know that doesn't have to be the case. So I'm always just curious what people think, like why we're in that situation. So I'll stop there. I think someone had a question.
So my question, because of my lens, is when you say read, do you mean read in English? And when you're assessing literacy and presenting in this space, is it monolingual literacy that you're assessing? Because as a Latina, I know sometimes my community is frustrated because we might be literate in our own language, but depending, and Jeff, depending on the study or the definition, it's not always part of the conversation. So I was just checking.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this issue of multilingual learners is something that we need to address. We've been looking, I don't know if you all have been looking, California is really taking this issue head on. I know there's concerns about sort of how the science of reading aligns with multilingual learners. I'll just be honest, I'm not an expert sort of on that piece of it. I'd just say that we're exploring that piece of it, want to, work with as many people as possible to, make sure that it's helping all kids. So.
Jeff, we have a question in the chat from Amy about the science of reading and what aspects of this approach will be able to address the need.
Sure. So, I mean, when we think of science of reading, right, it's probably the common definition, right? The 5 pillars: phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary comprehension. I always miss 1 or 2 of them. So I think one thing to think about is, right, when we think of science of reading, a lot of folks just focus on phonics, right? And that's a piece of it, certainly not the only piece. I was just been listening, I don't know if people have been listening to, there's a group called Knowledge Matters, which focuses on the importance of background knowledge. It's a really good podcast. I think it's called Knowledge Matters. So we know it's not just phonics. We need all those other 4 pieces, but also that focus on content knowledge, background knowledge, et cetera. So I think, our goal is to focus on all those pieces and make sure that at least districts are using curricula and instructional resources that are evidence-based, that do address the foundational skills, ideally though, but also bring in that content knowledge piece. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Jeff. And I would invite Amy if you had any follow-up to Jeff's comment.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you. I agree that those 5 pillars are important and something that we definitely address, especially in teacher education. And one of the things that I'm interested to hear about and wanted to see if there are, the science of reading now has kind of become one of the, I don't know, if the primary points of discussion in terms of literacy education. I'm just wondering if you've considered other approaches or ways of thinking about literacy outside of that would still meet the goals, which I definitely agree.
Yeah, so I would say number one, I'm a literacy policy expert, not a literacy PhD or expert in some of the details. My understanding is the science is pretty settled around, particularly in the foundational skills, that there needs to be that phonics component. As I mentioned, I think the background knowledge piece has to be included, and that's one thing that's been neglected. Beyond that, I mean, again, I'm open. I'd love to hear more. I mean, this is one of the challenges, right? I think, as you know, there's been a lot of studies showing that, things like whole language or balanced literacy are not effective. I know a lot of people still believe in those. But I think, frankly, that's one of the challenges. So, I think I'm open to other ideas, with the caveat that everything I've read and heard is that, the science and the research is pretty clear, what does work and what doesn't work. But I'd love to hear, like, if you have ideas or thoughts.
Just as a thought, and kind of want to share this. One of the things that one of the comments was about COVID and the impact of COVID, and we know that we are still going to be addressing that impact for quite some time. And I think about the reading by third grade sort of standard or an approach, but we know that kids have different developmental ranges and experiences, and even thinking about that background. And with that goal of third grade, it's I think in a longer conversation, not explicit, but sort of implied kids need to be able to read by third grade. And there's a definition of what that reading looks like, and who's responsible for that. And I guess I'm just wondering if there's a way that, there's that adage of learn to read and then read to learn. I guess I would really like to see the conversation and concept of literacy instruction be expanded, particularly beyond third grade, and actually kind of getting rid of that notion that you need to learn by third grade, and instead really thinking about what does literacy look like throughout the lifespan, or at least in school age, so that it doesn't become somebody else's responsibility, as in the younger grades, or the second grade teacher or the third grade teacher. In fact, by the time they get to biology in high school, that should also be literacy instruction by the high school biology teacher. So really, that literacy becomes a pre-K through 12 endeavor. And if we could approach it in that capacity, that all educators are literacy teachers, how would that, how could that shift the conversation? So away from thinking of specific sort of programs or approaches, but really about a mind shift of how we all engage in this. I guess that's something that I would feel really, I'd like to advocate for, and then shift that narrative. So my 2 cents, thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. No, I think we're certainly open to that. I mean, the research has been around for a long time around why third grade is important. With that said, I know we've been hearing a lot about, certainly like in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, right, because of COVID, that kids are lacking those foundational skills. So that's one of our recommendations, right, is to make sure, and as you know, a lot of those teachers are not trained as much, in how to teach kids how to read. So I think there has to be, certainly in those upper elementary grades, we need to focus on that, particularly in the context of COVID. But yeah, I mean, I think absolutely it has to be it's a birth to 12 birth, it starts at birth. That's one thing that we're thinking about, and that I really want to dig into in a little bit, is what's that role, in the 0 to 5 as well. So yeah, so I mean, I think we're open to that, but again, I think the research is pretty clear on why you need those foundational skills, right, in order to decode, in order to access text that, you know, happens after third grade. But yeah, I think we're definitely see that broader vision for sure.
Jeff, I think there was a couple, there's some really great conversation and comments that are happening in the chat. I'm mindful of that potentially some of these might be covered in some slides, future slides, particularly around the early, for the youngest years, right, the 0 to 5 and pre-K and childcare. So I just want to take a pause, but also invite folks to, if they want to uplift and come off mute if it's particularly a good space right now for you, Jeff, without knowing what the future may hold with some of these slides. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Great, thanks, Talia. And I know Mary Louise had the comment around early childhood and the developmentally, you know, the practices for preschool children.
I'd be happy to chat now, but I'm very willing to wait for the rest of this. And I did attend this, Jeff, at the Little Theater as well. And I just really wanted to hear what other people had to say about this. But I've been in early childhood for many, many years. And also I noted that night that we were looking for people from the local district, from the Rochester City School District, and did not notice there were a lot of people in that audience. And that's where I do most of my work in the childcare sector, where we do prepare children so well in those very early years. But all this learning has to be about their own discovery, their own curiosity. And when they hit kindergarten, it shouldn't be suddenly shut down those practices that really turn children on, and it should be literacy rich environments and all kinds of things. And remember that early childhood is birth through 8 years old. So we really need to be doing all the right things all the way. And we get children so ready to learn and have many, many early literacy experiences and do all those building blocks, but they're all developmentally appropriate. So I am worried about the push down impact and I'm a former teacher, and I used to teach grade 2 children. And I used all those methods that are now in the science of reading policies that we're seeing. But today's a very different day with some very different issues going on.
Great. So I will come back to that 0 to 8 piece in a moment. So thank you all for that. That's very helpful. So let me just kind of jump back into the slides, and then we can, just have a discussion. Where was I here? So close that up. So I think I'm sure Rachel shared the report that we put out. And really our goal was, we feel, particularly at the state level, this real lack of urgency around, whether you want to call it the science of reading, or to me, like, it's the fact that so many kids are struggling to read, knowing how foundational it is to everything. So that was really the impetus behind the report. We took really, I think, pretty comprehensive look across the state. The idea was to get a sense of what's the landscape right now across New York State. So before we propose any policies, we wanted to get a sense of what's actually happening. And so we did a poll of public school parents across the state. We did focus groups with teachers and students. We put out a survey to every district in the state. And then we did interviews and research with folks all across the state in this field. And what we found is, and this is super high level, but number one, as we all know, New York has a local control education system, really leaving decisions about curriculum, about instruction up to school districts. That's resulted in the use of a number of non-evidence-based reading instructional approaches. So in this So I mentioned we did a survey across the state to try and find out, how schools were teaching reading. One of the challenges is we only heard back from less than half of the schools, which gets at a transparency issue that I'll come back to. But we saw, a mix. So a mix of, sort of more of the structured literacy approaches, but the most common curriculum was units of study across the state. So we'd also, and the parent poll was really interesting. So we found overwhelming support for the idea of the science of reading, this idea of more transparency and support from schools. So I forget the exact stat, I think I have it here. So 85% of parents were unaware of what reading curriculum their school was using, but 89% of parents wanted to know that information. So it's clearly a disconnect there. One interesting piece that came out, would love people's thoughts on this when we get to the discussion, was, this notion, and particularly for those in the classroom, would love your thoughts. The notion that, we know that kids get different things before they get to kindergarten. But one of the questions was around if a student, gets to kindergarten without, they haven't had any support, they haven't had any instruction, their parents, for whatever reason, have not worked with them on literacy, are schools still responsible for teaching those kids how to read? And there's only 50% of parents believe that, which I found surprising. So I think there is, and one thing we found too is really it's kind of and I'm sure you all see it too, right? This instinct to blame parents, right? If students are not being able to read by the time they get to kindergarten or by the time they get to third grade. So that's just something we've seen a lot of, even from other parents, which surprised me. So I think there's something around that distinction. What's the role of parents? What's the roles of schools? What's the role of early childhood providers? I think is a really interesting tension that I'd love to explore. We talked with teachers. They were overwhelmingly on board with the concept of the science of reading. We also talked with a lot of high school teachers who saw, to Amy's point, saw the challenges of kids getting to high school and having challenges to read, and the implications that had for whether it was a social studies class or a science class. And then again, we talked about the teacher preparation issue and the fact that many schools are not providing teachers with instruction, in the science of reading, which obviously leads to challenges when teachers get to their schools. With that, we came out with sort of a 10-point policy plan, which is going to inform our work moving forward. So point one is this idea of evidence-based curriculum, instructional resources. I don't think we're going to mandate that across New York State, given that we're a local control state, but there's a lot of things that the state can do to incentivize that. I think we need to take a look at teacher preparation programs. We're working with some partners on that issue now. As you probably know, SUNY has a new chancellor that is very supportive of the science of reading. New Paltz just started a credential, micro-credential for teachers to get their micro-credential in the science of reading. So we're excited about that. We need to continue that focus on progress monitoring in K-3. Obviously, there needs to be a lot of professional learning and support for teachers to do this work. Like just adopting a curriculum is not going to do anything, right? There needs to be extensive support for educators. This idea of public reporting and transparency, right? So the state doesn't even collect information on how schools are teaching reading. I think we need to change that. I think parents have the right to know what's happening in their schools. And then this is, I think, a little more aligned with our group today. So, and as Rachel mentioned, it's my background. I work with the National Summer Learning Association. I work with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which has both a big family engagement piece as well as a sort of out of school times piece, right? And so I think it's got to be that 0 to 8 approach that Mary Louise talked about. It can't just be all on schools. I think there's so much that we can do, to engage families, to engage early childhood providers, to, engage summer and after school providers in this work. And ideally, in a perfect world, align it, right, with what the schools are doing. I know that's easier said than done, but that's the vision that we have. And then finally, I think there's a lot of interest in this idea of, blended learning technology. If you're in a class, let's say a 3rd or 4th grade class that has kids at 7 different grade levels, we need to figure out how do we support teachers in differentiating instruction. What are some of the tools out there that can help do that? And then finally, it has to be a campaign, right? Like we have to get everybody on board, and even if it's not around the science of reading, we have to get people on board about the importance of learning how to read, whatever that may look like, and that our current outcomes are not okay. So there's a lot more detail in the report on that. And then I'll close, just share kind of where we're at now as far as next steps. So the report came out in April or May. We did, as Mary Louise mentioned, also a report on Monroe County as well. And so what we're hoping to do to move this work forward is, one, build a statewide coalition around this. We're toying or exploring the idea of kind of that 0 to 8 approach. I'll be honest, we started more in the K3 piece just because that's where the interest was. But the more I think about it, I'd really love to explore like a 0 to 8 approach. And that's what I'd love to get people's thoughts on that. And really the ideas behind the coalition is, number one, to build awareness, right, around all the things that we just talked about. And then ultimately get more advocacy, right? Like our goal is to introduce legislation next year during the next legislative session. So get advocates across the state working on that. And then hopefully when policies are adopted, then support implementation, because that's where the hard work is, right? So that's the vision for the coalition. Our thinking right now, as far as policy changes, top priorities are again around that curriculum, instructional resources, the aligned professional learning for educators, the teacher prep reform, that community support and alignment piece, which I would love to get people's thoughts on, and then the public transparency. And then again, I mentioned, the vision is, if and when we get these policies passed, is that we could really support districts, communities in the implementation work, right? Through sharing of best practices, continued advocacy, meetings, briefs, those kinds of things. And then I think I've only got 2 more slides. So, this is where, again, would love to think with you all. I don't think she's on, but I'm sure many of you know Jen O'Connor is on our team. So we've been talking a lot about this. How do we kind of bring together that 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 work through Raising New York and the work you're all doing, and bring it into this larger discussion. So we've talked about, how do we improve collaboration at the state level, talked about the role of kindergarten readiness assessments, screenings, I know you all are working on, and then the things I know that you're already working on, but how do we kind of make sure that it's a connected, aligned part of a system, right? To Amy's point, whether that's 0 to 8 or 0 to 20, how do we make sure that everybody knows about these things and are getting the support that they need? And then I'll close, I mentioned this at the event at the Little, I think, particularly when we focus on the data, it can be a little bit grim, a little bit distressing. It's a solvable crisis, right? We all know what to do, but we've got to get everybody on the same page. We've got to get everybody working together. As I said, we're going to advocate at the state level as well as the local level, right? There's nothing preventing school districts or local communities from doing all these things, right? So this can work both ways. And then always leave on this quote from Frederick Douglass, who spent much of his life here in Rochester, right? And this really drives our work. Once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. So that's what drives us. I know it drives all of you. So with that, I'll open it up. I put down a bunch of questions, but it sounds like there's already, some questions out there. So I don't know if people want to just jump in, or I can, go through some of these. So I'll just open it up.
Jeff, thank you so much. What I'm wondering, it might be helpful just so we can see each other, just as our community and for this discussion, if you could stop sharing your slides and then maybe we can go back to some of them as a reference point. Thank you. And I've been absolutely loving the conversation and the connection and the chat. That's what this is all about, right? And the questions and comments have been really rich. I wanted to elevate one as a starters, and I have a whole list. So Jeff, to give you a break of reading, even though today is all about reading and literacy, one of the comments that came out from Jerica was kind of that tension between kids' readiness for school and schools ready for children. And I wonder, just within the context of your report and recommendations and your expertise, how you're thinking about that, and how these recommendations relate to some of that tension of, we want kids to be ready for school, but we also need schools to be ready to accept all children where they are in their developmental progress and health.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of laid it out right there. I mean, our vision, yeah, is that, right, school, no matter whatever kids have had, we need to meet them where they are. You know, I think from what I've read, the research is clear that you know, kids can learn to read depending, you know, even if they haven't had everything they need before then. So I mean, that's our vision. With that said, you know, there's so much that parents can do that can happen in that 0 to 5 space, and I think we need to do a better job of that. But yeah, I don't know, I was taken aback. I mean, anytime you see an article like in the New York Times about reading, you look in the comment section, which you should never do, it's all about, you know, well, it's the parents' fault, it's not the school's fault. We certainly don't agree with that, but I think we need to be cognizant that that is out there, you know, and do all we can do to empower parents. I mean, the event at the Little that we did, I mean, we had a lot of parents there, and many of them, their takeaway was that they didn't know about this information, and they were concerned about how to get that information to other parents. So I think this work has to have that. And the campaign for grade level reading, I think, did a pretty good job of that. But, you know, we've got to, you know, share these best practices, share these resources, you know, which can be as simple as, you all know, as, you know, talking more with kids and getting books, or, you know, surrounding kids with books and things like that. And just making sure that parents have access to those things. So in a perfect world, kids are getting everything they need, but if they don't, you know, like, we think it's up to schools and the whole community, right, to give them what they need to get them where they need to be.
Thank you, Jeff. I also, just for, we have folks from all over the state and region. So when we're talking about the Little, it's a theater no worries. It's a theater in Rochester that Jeff and some community partners within the greater Rochester community showed the Right to Read documentary, and there was a panel discussion. So that is that reference. I see, Patty, you had your hand raised, so I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask a question or share a comment.
Thank you, Rachel. I just want to give a little background. I'm currently retired. I'm representing the Niagara Area Foundation today as a board member, but I've got extensive background. Rachel, I think you know this, Connie, with early childhood, overseeing programs, probably one of the most successful in Niagara County. But I also was an assistant dean in a teacher education program in the college at Niagara University for 16 years. So 2 points I'd like to make today. I see on your slide, Jeff, you have the words like advocacy. I think 2 other words need to be put on that: alignment and disconnect. And until we put those 2 together and how we can make those work, I don't think we're going to solve anything. The first being, when you do developmental screenings, we try to hit children before 3 years old. Yet our early childhood, or our pre-K programs in New York State start at 4. So the brain develops fully at 3, and we have a whole year of sitting there that we're not assuring these kids that they're getting the quality professional development and training that they need from the teachers that could help them. That's number 1. And number 2, I think a huge disconnect with the teacher ed programs that comes from a state level, because and it's only 2 courses in literacy that they need. And in today's world, nobody can teach literacy well constructed in a 6-hour fashion. But until it's understood that even those 2 sequences of courses, they need to be broken out from pre-K to 3 and 4 to 6 for educators in elementary that are birth to 6, because it's 2 different worlds, as we're talking about today. And, you know, and with that, we really believe that reading is a science. In many ways, if we got teacher prep programs to believe it's also an art, you'd have teachers that could really engage kids in a whole different way. And now I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. That's super helpful. And I will say that we are, with some partners, really digging into that teacher prep piece. And so if you're interested, we're putting together kind of like informal steering committee. So, if you're interested, shoot me a note. I'd love to connect you with them, because I think, and I've heard that a lot, right? That, the training and that those 2 courses certainly are not enough. So thanks for sharing that.
Other questions or comments? Talia and Amy have received platinum status of going back in the chat. I'm so happy for some connections that are being made, right? That is all part of this learning opportunity and connections with each other. So I'll invite Talia or Amy, if you want to share a couple of your comments. I know that there was, Talia, you had shared some resources about summer enrichment and summer slide, and how can we look at summer as an opportunity to strengthen, and what might be some innovative either pilots or policies that could address some of that. But Talia, please, I'd invite you to share.
I really appreciate the conversation. So I did share an article in the link about summer program, which is a nationally federally funded program, where in PA they've done some literacy work that reflects some of my work and the work of Help Me Grow in Buffalo Public Housing with our Buffalo Public School kids. But I think the one point that I did want to get to, Jeff, thinking specifically from the Latino lens and my lived experience as someone who had a really hard time learning how to read, is kind of thinking about engaging with the local school district, as well as that kind of back and forth about curriculum as civic engagement, and how our parents from different communities may see a higher or lower efficacy within themselves to be engaged in that way. So just as an academic, just like a kind of another layer there. And there's some research I can send you, or I could send to Rachel, that talks about the civic engagement gap within a lot of communities that we know disproportionately struggle to learn how to read. But also, howdy everyone, and hi Amy. I'm super excited to be here.
Great, well, thank you for that. That's super helpful. I mean, I will say one thing, and maybe this isn't what you're thinking, but we do a lot of work with parent advocacy groups. You probably know Sam Radford in Buffalo. We work with Sam quite a bit. So one of the things we're thinking about is, how do we help parents advocate for their kids, with their school district, whether it's about, what's their curriculum approach, that sort of thing. I don't know if that's what you're thinking, or, but certainly, and then just being able to read, obviously, impacts your ability to engage civically as well. But that's kind of how we've been thinking about it.
Absolutely, because I have a law degree and a policy degree from SUNY, and I try to inform my perspective with history, just because I learned so little about my own history. So there's a bilingual charter school in Monroe County. I went to St. John Fisher, and I'm really interested, Jeff, to take a look inside the report about Monroe and see kind of how the variances in the reporting shifted there. But happy to talk with you and Rachel more offline about some of those other groups that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Others, I have a running list from the chat, but any others that want to jump in with a comment or a question? So I'll pull one from the chat. There was a question, Jeff, when you were talking about the survey work. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the sort of responses and the communities that responded, and the makeup of any additional information from a demographics that could help to lend? We know that often historically underrepresented folks are often not at the table. So could you talk a little bit about the survey and who you heard from and what that looked like?
Yeah, and I can share the really detailed data with you. I don't have it with me, but it was we worked with a pretty big polling firm in New York City that we've done a lot of different polls with. So it was 800 public school parents across the state, and it was representative of, geography, race, very, very representative across the state. So we did, there was that piece of it. And then, the other mixed methods piece. So we did an online focus group with teachers across the state. I'm trying to remember how many. I don't have the number, but it was sort of it was kind of interesting. So instead of doing a poll, it was like a 3-day, online place where we'd facilitated, where people would ask questions and folks could talk or share their answers online. So we got a lot of really good data. Again, teachers all across the state, representative, and again, elementary, but also middle school, high school teachers as well. And then the student focus groups, we actually did one in Rochester through the Urban League, and then one in New York City with one of our partners there. So again, mostly, well, all urban communities, just trying to get a sense of kind of what students' thoughts were. That one was challenging. I did some of those. It was a little tough to kind of get stuff out of kids, but something we're going to continue to work on. So we've tried to be really, thoughtful and get as much feedback as we could, from folks. And I can share, if people are interested, I can share the methodology. I have that somewhere. So.
Thanks. I think we definitely will be sharing in the materials from today, the presentation, the recording, and I think there's some great resources that have been shared in the chat. And Jeff, the particular Monroe County case study and report that was done, it's really impactful and really an important piece of this, of really a deep dive. So we will definitely, and anyone who's attending today that would like to send any resources or information or perspective, please send that to me directly, and we'll get it in the notes so that we all have access to each other's good thinking and wisdom. So a couple other things. I see Amy has her hand raised, and then a note popped up from Mary Louise. So Amy and then Mary Louise.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. I was looking at the report, and as a researcher, I always like to see kind of where's like what's behind it all and where did the information come. And I think for me, one of the things that I am cautious of, or kind of is one of those flags to me, is when a sort of a report, a justification starts with the research says, and I want to know whose research, like where did that come from? Who's determining the research? Because there's a lot of research out there, and some of it's really strong, and some of it started off strong and then has continued to be revisited. There's for example, there's the 30,000 word gap or whatever that's still often referenced, and it's been completely, explored and deconstructed and challenged, but we still kind of hold on to certain notions of what counts as research. So I think that's part of it. The other thing that I get concerned about is when a certain sort of approach, especially if it's been supported or initiated by an organization or a special interest group, becomes what is used as the primary model that others then want to advocate for. Or when it may start off as one thing, but once it's become policies or we turn it into official curriculum, it becomes commodified from something that is a framework of best practices that then gets concretized into sort of scripts and very specific steps that need to be followed. And then it's only through that you get the desired outcomes. And I guess that's one of the things that I'm hesitant with in terms of the science of reading as a whole is, I'm looking at the report, and when we started talking about, like, one of the curriculums now is Lucy Calkins. That was one of the things Lucy Calkins didn't start off as a curriculum. It was an approach to engaging students with writing. It was an approach to writing. And through the pressures of policy and naming and large scale research, did it become sort of morphed into a packaged curriculum that you buy and you have to get trained on and implement it. So I guess that's one of I actually applaud New York State for not adopting something officially, because that allows for more conversation and flexibility and exploration. Similarly, the questions about what are the underpinnings and root causes of challenges in literacy, learning, instruction, and performance, I think is a much larger conversation about the structure of schools and what we're expecting kids to do by age, by grade, by performance standard, than how that can be then sort of the, whatever the curriculum measure may be, or the instructional measure. No, they're all related and important, but you know, why are these disparities? Why are there gaps? Why why are we seeing the variations even across the state? So, in demographics.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack in that. I think where to start? I think in the science, I mean, we're really relying on, you know, the brain science, the cognitive science around, you know, the importance of explicit instruction and foundational skills. I think that's the main research we're talking about. You know, I agree there's a lot of other pieces out there that are not, you know, not as settled, you know, open to that. And again, I'm not a researcher, but everything I've read is that that piece of it is settled. It's been around for decades. Trying to think of your other points. I'm sorry, I kind of lost. I know there's a lot in there. Yeah, I mean, I think the flexibility thing is it's a tension, it's an issue, right? I think certainly if you're getting good outcomes, and again, you know, and I mean, really the only instrument that we have right now is our state assessments or NAEP, or I know local districts have formative pieces. Everything that's out there shows that we have a crisis and that kids are struggling. And so, you know, I think if a certain approach is working, that's great. But I think given how important literacy is, and if a district is doing something that's not, or at least, you know, indicated that's not evidence-based and kids are not learning to read, like, I think that's a problem. And I think there has to be, someone has to step in, whether it's the state, whether it's the community, whether it's somebody, because it's just not okay. Like, I don't know. So that, you know, I'm sympathetic, and I know teachers like to, you know, like autonomy and all, and that's important. And we don't want to like tell teachers what to do. And I think there's always room for, you know, for making teaching an art. But I also feel like there's got to be certain pieces that follow what we know, if that helps. So.
Thanks, Jeff. Amy, thank you for being such a great thought leader in this space.
Yeah, Amy, let's talk more, because Amy and I went to college together, so we need to talk more. Yeah. Oh, and if I could, so Mary Louise had a really good question I want to address, because so that's a great question. Do we have the ear of state ed in the region? So no, to the point where state ed will not talk to us or return our calls. So they did not like our report. The regions, I think, are, you know, sort of in step with that. We're talking with a few that are interested and want to do more on this issue. If you're interested, we need to put more pressure on them, I think, because doing nothing is not enough. What they'll say is, we put standards out and it's up to districts what they do with them. I'm just going to say that's not enough, right? That's not working, particularly when 46 other states have passed policies, and not just places like Mississippi that you've heard of. Connecticut has a list of curriculum that districts have to choose from. Massachusetts has provided grants for districts to adopt evidence-based curriculum. There's so much that the state can and should do, and they're not doing it. They need to hear from more people that the status, I mean, no matter what you feel, the status quo is not good enough, period. And that's where the state, to me, that's where state ed, that's where the regions are. And that's what this coalition is meant to do, is disrupt the status quo.
Well, I think we do have an opportunity. We have a Wade Norwood, a local regent, and Ruth Turner also, right? And so I think that we can mobilize a little bit and at least invite people to meetings or whatever, those of us who work in Rochester, and get people to listen. And I believe state ed, at least the early learning department, has sort of reorganized. And I don't know the personalities there like I did in the past, but I know that our state education department will not necessarily say this is what you need to do, but they could follow what you're suggesting and look at what's out there and give some leadership, because many people won't do anything without it.
Exactly.
And then and I think Amy's point about a framework versus scripted curriculum is I've seen examples of that with what's going on right now in Rochester in early childhood department. So I think we have to be so cautious about when we talk about one curriculum, but there are some very proven methods, and those 5 pillars, I mean, that's stuff we can handle and work on for sure. So I think I mean, I'm very willing to join in something where we can have a greater influence. And also the early childhood development initiative, I think maybe that's something to bring to attention to that table, and maybe we can recommend at least hearing more or bringing you there, Jeff. I don't know, but we can talk further.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Well, we have reached 1 o'clock. What a robust discussion and conversation today. I'm so grateful. Thank you all so very much. Jeff, thank you. And to Education Trust New York for really just leaning in so much on this. Really, this is critical. And so I'm just grateful for your leadership and your willingness to share your perspective and to hear from folks from across the state and the Western New York region on what might work best. And I think there's a real opportunity, and I'll just uplift that we did have a comment in the chat from one of our partners in medicine and health of just the role of pediatric practices in addressing this, and Reach Out and Read, as well as our community-based organizations, early childhood initiatives, higher ed, that we're all part of the solution. And to your earlier, in one of your first slides, why is this not being talked about? Where is the outrage? And I think that together we can collectively amplify and champion some of these solutions that you've put forth. So I'm, again, very grateful for you being here today, and to all of you that attended and took a little bit of your afternoon out to hang out with Liftoff and Jeff. So with that, thank you. We will be sending the slides, we'll be sending the presentation, some of those materials, and I'll be sure to include Jeff's contact information for additional points of connection and thought exchange. So thank you everyone very much.
Yeah.
And Jeff, closing thoughts?
Yeah, so thank you all so much. I think this has been really helpful. I think as you all know, sometimes in this field, sometimes I'm in a bit of an echo chamber, right, where people are fully on board with science of reading. So it's great to get a little bit of pushback and just a little bit of different perspectives. So I really appreciate that. And, you know, as Rachel, share my contact info, would love to keep connecting and, you know, keep getting different perspectives on this, because I know we all want the same thing, right? So, so yeah, let's keep in touch, and thank you. Thanks for being there.
All right, great. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.
Have a wonderful day and rest of your summer.
Thanks. Bye-bye.